founder at 10x Coder Kids, and today you're gonna learn about prototypes and the prototype chain in JavaScript. So let's get started. Okay, so in JavaScript, every object inherits properties and methods from a prototype. A prototype, in simple terms, can be viewed as a base object that is associated with all functions and objects by default. For example, you have an object constructor, right? So you can define some prototype properties that will be there for all the objects made by from that object constructor, right? So a prototype, like you can define properties in the prototype. For example, I have a person object constructor. I can set its a prototype property. So I can make a prototype property, for example x, right? And that x property will be for all the objects, right? It will be there for all the objects, one same value for all the objects inside of that basically the person object constructor, right? So all the objects of the person object constructor, right? So for example, a prototype in simple terms can be viewed as a base object that is associated with all functions and objects by default. So for example, a date object inherits date.prototype, a array inherits array.prototype, and a person object will inherit from a person.prototype. Additionally, all of these objects will inherit object.prototype. So first of all, we can log prototype on type. So array.prototype we can log out, so we'll get an array. And we can also log out, we can also create an array, right, instance, and then we can log out the prototype value using the underscore proto underscore. So these are the two ways to log out the prototype. So over here, first way we got the prototype, and the second way also we got the prototype. So both give us the same values. Pretty cool, right? So for example, I have a person, for example I have a function person, right? And this is my object constructor, right? So now I can set a prototype value in this person dot prototype dot x equals to hi. So now what will be there, every object created by the person object constructor will have an x property in their prototype object that will have the value of hi, right? So hi will always be there, the value for x will always be high for every object. Prototype properties value will be the same for every object of the object constructors whose prototype has the variable and the value, right? So for example, our person object constructor has the prototype x. So now x will be x value will be same for every object created by the person object constructor, right? So cool. So I'll just comment this. Now we are gonna move on to the prototype chain, inheritance and the prototype chain. First of all, we are gonna see how we can build longer inheritance chain. So right now what was happening, I'm gonna show you. So we had an array, this is our array prototype. In that we had that inherited from the object prototype, object.prototype, right? And then this, okay, so where is it? So now this inherited, okay, so then basically over here what is happening, it is again inheriting from object.prototype, and then we are getting null. So basically what is a chain? Let me show you the chain. It is basically our array, then it has the array, it is inheriting from array.prototype, that is inheriting from object.prototype, and that object.prototype is inheriting from null, right? So building longer inheritance chains. So the constructor.prototype property will become the prototype of the constructor's instance, as is including constructor.prototype's own prototype. By default, constructor.prototype is a plain object, right? So it is a plain object, that is object.getPrototype of constructor.prototype equals object.prototype. So This is basically saying, for example, we have a constructor, object constructor, right? That prototype is a plain object, right? That is equals to object dot get prototype of your constructor's prototype equals to object dot prototype. The only exception is the object dot prototype itself, whose prototype is null. That is object dot get prototype of object dot prototype equals null. So if we bring the prototype of object dot prototype, then that will give us null. If we bring the prototype of constructor's prototype, that will bring us object dot prototype. I've told you the chain. We have a constructor, inside we have a constructor prototype that inherits from object dot prototype, and that inherits from null. So now if the constructor dot prototype, if we bring out the constructor's prototype sub prototype, right? So if we bring constructor dot prototype, that will be equals to the object dot prototype, right? And if we bring the prototype of object dot prototype, that will be equals to null. Therefore, a typical constructor will build the following prototype chain. So if we have a constructor and we create an object of this constructor, the chain will be object inherits from constructor dot prototype. So this prototype that inherits from object dot prototype, that finally inherits from null. To build longer prototype chains, we can set the prototype of constructor.prototype via the object.set prototype of function. So what is this? Now let's look into this. So what we have a base and then we have a derived. Both are object constructors, right? Set the prototype of derived.prototype to base.prototype. Right, so by default, let's see derived.prototype chain. So if we create an object of derived, then we will have that object that will basically inherit from derived.prototype, that will basically inherit from object.prototype, that will basically inherit from null. Now we are expanding the prototype chain. Yeah, right? So what we are doing object.set prototype of derived.prototype base.prototype. So what is happening? We are saying that derived.prototype's prototype will not inherit from object.prototype. It will inherit from base.prototype, right? So it will inherit from base.prototype, that afterwards will inherit from object.prototype. So now this is our expanded this is our expanded prototype chain, right? So this is our expanded prototype chain, and this will be our final prototype chain. Object that inherits from derived.prototype, that inherits from base.prototype, that inherits from object.prototype, and that inherits from null, right? I hope I'm clear. Right? So inspecting proper prototypes, a deeper dive. Let's look at what happens behind the scenes a bit more in detail. So we have function do something right now, right? So we have function do something, console.log do something.prototype. So what it does not matter how you define this function object constructor. It could be capital, first letter could be capital, it could be small, right? You can define it anyway. You could have done do something, for example, like this. But the standard is that you do first letter capital in an object constructor. That is standard, but you don't need to do it, right? It is not a compulsory thing to do. You can define your object constructors as you want to, right? And then we are logging out its prototype. So it does not matter how you declare the function. A function in JavaScript will always have a default prototype property, with one exception. An arrow function does not have a default prototype property. So an arrow function never has a default prototype property. So if we try to access prototype, it will give us an error. So if we access normal functions prototype, it will give us. But if we try to access the prototype of an arrow function, it is not giving us an error. It is giving us undefined, because it is not able to find any prototype property inside that arrow function. right? And one more thing, I'll give you extra information, right? This is extra information that related to arrow functions, not related to prototypes, that when you have an arrow function, you cannot basically create objects from arrow functions. Like, you cannot use a new syntax with arrow functions. So you cannot do, like, for example, some instance equals to new do something from arrow function. You cannot do this. Arrow function does not support the new keyword, right? So pretty cool stuff. You can object constructors can only be created by the by normal functions, not by arrow functions, right? Pretty cool. So we can add properties to the prototype of do something, right? So we can add properties to the prototype of do something. So, like, for example, how can we add properties to the prototype? We have do something. You're doing do something dot prototype dot foo. So in foo we are adding bar, right? So now in the property of do something, prototype of do something, we'll have a foo property that will basically have the value bar. So if we log out do something dot prototype, then we'll have the prototype in which we'll see the foo property. So we see the foo property inside our prototype, right? Whose value is bar. Pretty cool. So we can now use the operator to create an instance of do something based on this prototype. So we can now create an instance. So we have do something. In its prototype we are adding a foo value, that is bar, right? And then we have do some instancing, right? And we are creating an object of the from the do something object constructor, right? So now do some instancing is an object, and do some instancing, we are setting we are making a property for do some instancing. Do some instancing dot prop is equals to some value, and then if we log out do some instancing, then we will have the prop property. We'll have the prototype. We'll see the prototype in which we'll have the foo property. So we have do something in which we have this is our object which has prop property. It also has a prototype in which we see the foo property, right? As we added it to the prototype. Pretty cool, right? So let's try entering some more code into the console. So this thing. So now I want the result from you. Do this side by side. So do some this is the same code over here. So do some instancing dot prop. What will it bring? It will bring some value. Do some instancing dot foo. What will this bring? Nothing. It could have two results. Either it could be undefined or it could be bar. What will it be? It will be bar. Why would it be bar? Now let's understand why it would be bar. It would be bar because what JavaScript does in an object, when it searches for a property and it finds it in the object, then it's good. If it is not able to find it in the object, it looks into its prototype. If it finds the property in the prototype, then it gives us its value. So it searched for foo in the object, it could not find it. It checks in the prototype and it finds foo. So it gives us bar. Pretty cool. Then do something dot prop, that is nothing, right? Do something dot foo. So now this could have two results, undefined or bar. So now this will give us, guys, undefined. Why? Whenever you are checking whenever you're trying to access a property from the object constructor that is in the prototype, or prototype, right? So that is in the prototype. So you always need to specify that you want to access this property from the prototype. You cannot say do something dot foo and it can automatically take it from the prototype. No, you will have to specify that access this property from the prototype. So this will give us undefined. Then do something dot prototype dot prop, that will give us undefined, and then do something dot prototype dot foo, that will give us bar. So the output will be some value bar undefined, undefined, undefined bar. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so sorry if you can hear any back. Okay, so some value bar undefined, undefined, undefined bar, right? Pretty cool. So now different ways of creating and mutating prototype chains. Objects created with syntax constructs. So what is this? Let's see. So for example, we have an O object that has A1. Right? So the newly created object O has object prototype as its prototype. Object prototype has a null as its prototype. So the chain will be this O has object prototype that has null. Then B, it has yo, what up, and question mark. So array inherits from array.prototype. So the prototype chain looks like this. B inherits from array.prototype inherits from object.prototype, and that inherits from null. So this is the prototype chain. Then function f return to. Function inherits from function.prototype, which has methods call, bind, etc. So f inherits from function.prototype, that inherits from object.prototype, that inherits from null. And finally, constant p, in which we have b equals to, and then b is a property, not this, okay? So b equals to and proto. So we are changing a prototype to O. So it is possible to point the newly created object's prototype to another object via the proto, literal property, not to be confused with the object.prototype.proto. This is very important. This is the literal property. It should not be confused with the object.prototype.proto accessor, right? So now what is the chain? It is P inherits from O, that inherits from object.prototype, that inherits from null. Very cool, guys. Next we have with constructor functions. So in this let's uncomment this. So in this what we have a graph function, object constructor, right? This dot vertices equals empty array, this dot edges equals empty array. Graph.prototype.add vertex. So in prototype we are adding add vertex, in which we have whose value is a function, right? And then constant g equals new graph. So we are creating an object of a graph constructor. So g is an object with own properties, vertices, and edges. So g has its own properties, vertices, and edges. Prototype is the value of graph.prototype when the new graph is executed. So when we access G's prototype, so it will give us the value of graph.prototype, right? So graph.prototype and G.prototype will always remain the same when new graph is executed, right? So what we have, the chain will be something like this. So G inherits from object.prototype, that inherits from null, right? So okay, once again. So yeah, so it will be G. Okay, I'm a bit confused. So what will be the prototype chain? So it will be object. Yeah, okay, sorry. G inherits from graph.prototype, that will inherit from object.prototype, that will inherit from null. Pretty cool, right? And not to be confused, vertices and edges are not part of prototype, right? So it is not part of prototype. Prototype, you have to add properties yourself in the prototype. Nothing by itself will be there in the prototype, okay? And also it makes sense. For example, you accepted some values in graph and you set vertices and edges to those values. So in a prototype, one standard value is there for all objects, but here there would have been different values, so either way it could not be part of the prototype, right? Finally, with object.setPrototype of. So in this we have a constant object a1, constant another object b2, and we set prototype of object to another object. So now what will be the prototype chain? Object will inherit from another object, that will inherit from object.prototype, that will inherit from null. And this was it, guys, for this video. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, please don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe. Thank you guys. Bye.